former Liberal Democrat leader Charles Kennedy. He's in Fort William in Scotland. And from Baslow in Derbyshire, we're joined by the former Home Secretary for Labour, David Blunkett. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us. Charles Kennedy, do you agree with your leader that if, rather than having a hung parliament, we have a narrow victory for one of the Conservative or Labour parties, then we could be faced with a Greek-style crisis and serious social strife?
Well, I think if you've got a government that emerges which doesn't really have an emphatic popular mandate, however that's interpreted, then proceeds with some pretty draconian public expenditure slashbacking, then you will get clearly a big backlash from the public. And that's why one of the things we're saying, and I know it's great to stare into the crystal ball, what kind of arithmetic will it be? Really, whatever the arithmetic of the next House of Commons, all the parties know and the public know there are some pretty tough decisions to be faced, and what we'll need to do post-election is not stop the dialogue of a general election campaign. Actually, we're going to have to ratchet it up in advance of further spending measures that will probably have to be introduced in June. And that has been done in other countries, notably Canada. It's not really been done in Britain. I think politics is going to have to change its ways.
So, David Blunkett, what do you think of that idea? Better a secure government, a secure lab-lib pact, than a very narrow and vulnerable Labour majority?
Well, two things. Firstly, it is self-evident that we will need stability, because otherwise the bond markets and those who are constantly engaged in undermining the economic security would have a field day. Secondly, I mean, Charles is right. If you have draconian cuts, which is what Nick Clegg was talking about, don't normally agree with Nick Clegg, but he might remember when he was a youngster that in his now city of Sheffield, we were the only city in Britain that didn't have riots in the early 1980s. I know, because I was leader of the city at the time. We had the most enormous draconian cuts, the kind of things that the Conservatives are talking about, not 6 billion, not 12 billion, but 30-odd billion pounds of cuts, which devastate the services that people that I represent actually rely on.
And you think those are avoidable, do you?
I think they're avoidable. Yes, I do think they're avoidable. I think they're avoidable by actually being honest about what you have to raise in national insurance. I think we can be honest about the timescales over which we have to address these issues, as we did in the post-war era, where we had enormous debt from the war and the post-war borrowing that Maynard Keynes negotiated, and to have a bit of sense about how long it takes to bring about genuine savings, as opposed to slashing people's jobs, undermining people's services.
Well, Charles Kennedy, I mean, my understanding, therefore, is that the deal's off. I mean, Nick Clegg is saying to Labour, let us in the government and we'll back you on cuts. And now we got David Blunkett saying we don't think we need to implement cuts at all.
Adam, I think on the first weekend of the campaign, you're running a bit ahead of the plot here, if I may say so. I don't think Nick Clegg's saying or has said anything of the sort. I've been out on the campaign trail with him this week, and I don't recognise the rubric that you're using there.
Yeah, but we know the footsie's underway. The footsie is pretty obvious, isn't it? I mean, we've heard a lot of attacks from the Liberal Democrats on the Conservatives. Vince Cable saying the businessmen who backed the Conservatives were nauseating. Nick Clegg saying the Conservative plans will lead to massive increases in VAT. I mean, that's where the cozying up is going on, isn't it, between your two parties?
Well, look, pick your newspaper title, even today, and you can see interpretations that Nick Clegg or Vince Cable have said this or used that word in this context or another word in a different context. That means that they're distancing themselves from the Conservatives.
Well,
that means they're trying to put clear water between us and Labour. So it goes on and on and on. Beg your pardon?
Tell me a nice thing that any Liberal Democrat has said about a Conservative.
Well, I say quite a lot of nice things about Conservatives. I had my first two public meetings last night and I wasn't nasty about the Conservatives at all. And indeed in this interview I've been saying all politicians of all parties post the general election have got a big process of continuing engagement with the public, because we know, the public know, they're not daft, that we're facing a very, very serious economic scenario here, and that there are going to have to be big decisions taken. And the more that you can build not just cross-party consensuses in the House of Commons, but actually a wider public acquiescence, at least, for the direction of travel that you need to take, the better it will be. Now, that's the responsible approach. And I think actually it devalues the dialogue that should be going on over these next 3.5 weeks. If everything's just put through the prism of a word used here, a word used there, that means they're closing up.
I understand that, but let's put this to David Blunkett. I mean, the reality is, David Blunkett, that we've had Lord Adonis and Gordon Brown making overtures to Liberal Democrat voters. The reality is, if the polls are right and there is a hung parliament, that's going to be the deal, isn't it? Yellow, red.
Well, they're doing what we always need to do, which is to win over other votes from potential electors. In other words, we're trying to say to those who would vote Lib Dem, vote for us, and they're doing the same. And I think this last week's been extremely frustrating and in many cases very irritating. We've had the great story of the week is that some businessmen back the Tories, some businessmen want massive public expenditure cutbacks that won't affect them rather than tax increases. Now, I hope that the next 3.5 weeks will elevate the campaign onto something a bit better than that, with a vision of Britain for the future.
We've got these debates coming up. Opinion polls today say that the public expects David Cameron to be the best performer in the debates. Is that how you would nap it beforehand, David Blunkett?
No, I don't, because I think people will want to see all three of the leaders as they really are. Gordon Brown, as someone who has led internationally on the most important thing we face, which is the economic recovery. David Cameron, performing, yes, but performing with what behind it? What is the offer? The offer is draconian cutbacks. The offer is ephemeral additional expenditure increases for the better off, tax breaks for those inheritance over £1 million. And Nick Clegg, who I think is doing his best. I mean, he's a fellow Sheffield MP of mine, and I like him. But I think he's got to show a great deal more gravitas on the economic front if anyone's going to take him seriously.
Charles Kennedy, you must really be thinking, actually, I'd do a better job than Nick Clegg.
Well, actually, what I'm thinking this weekend is, as you can see from the tranquil, sunny surroundings in the West Highlands, that at least I'm not sitting here having to burn the midnight oil for this debate coming up later in the week. So there's an air of relief in the Kennedy household on that one, I can tell you. But you're right in the sense that this is a big opportunity. The very fact these debates are taking place, I think, is good for the democratic process. I think that outweighs the worry that, oh, it's all becoming too presidential. And I think also that from a Lib Dem point of view, the fact that we've got over these 3 debates, 90 minutes, primetime TV, your channel and the other channels, it gives a status that Paddy Ashdown, myself, David Steele would have loved to have enjoyed. So,
OK, we'll have to leave it there. Gentlemen, thank you both very much indeed. Lots coming up in the next hour.
Damien Hirst, Lily Allen, Tom Baker, Will Self, David Starkey.